My personal preference is for low alcohol beer because I like drinking beer, and you can't drink a lot of really strong beer. People could brag about their alcohol tolerance or whatnot, but that's just early onset alcoholism and whatnot. Like, lower alcohol beer is the only way you can really drink beer in reasonable quantities and not be doing yourself permanent damage.
Maintaining consistency is so important when it comes to brewing for the masses. Another important thing consumers care about, alcohol content, which is just what you're about to learn in our next lesson. Then you'll hear from our experts about what to do when things go wrong.
Figuring out the ABV in a beer is you start with your wort, which is your fermentable sugars, potential fermentable sugar. You have your strain of yeast, which has a range of how much they're going to ferment that beer out. Attenuation is the term of how much the yeast will knock that fermentable sugar down. 65 to 70% on some strains, 70 to 75 on others, 75 to 80 plus on other strains. So you're buying your champagne, you've got your extra dry, your brut, and that's all how much sweetness you want to have in that beverage. With your picking your strain and deciding how much alcohol you want in your beer, you factor those two in and you measure the density of the beer. So you have water, which is the density on a scale of density is 1.000. You add sugar to that, the density goes up. In specific gravity or Plato, bricks, whatever scale you want to use to measure sugar. So in specific gravity, the fermentable sugars you add, you may start with like a 1.050, and that's how much sugar you put on top of the water. When the yeast go in, they eat that sugar. You get alcohol, which is lighter than water, and the sugar depletes. So that 1.050 drops and drops and drops and drops to the point where you might hit like 1.009. Arbitrary numbers, but you can check it each day with your hydrometer, and you can see how much the sugar's dropping. And you know when you're done fermenting because you're going to hit that number day after day after day after day. So you know your beer's done. You take what you started with, you take what you finished with, you subtract the two, and then you get a alcohol calculator online, and you just plug those two numbers in and hit enter, and it spits out what your alcohol by weight is, and then it converts it to alcohol by volume.
Measuring alcohol content, I wish I could remember when they started doing it. Oh man. The mid-1800s, I want to say, the hydrometer started to be widely used, and the hydrometer is a means of measuring the gravity of a fluid, so the density of the fluid. And high sugar content increases the density of the fluid, and when you have alcohol being less dense than water, as the sugar is turned into alcohol, the density is decreased. So you use the hydrometer to measure your initial starting sugar content, and then as you progress through fermentation, you're able to use the decreasing density as measured through the hydrometer to then calculate your alcohol content. What you do is you take your starting gravity, so the initial wort sugar content, subtract that, and subtract the final gravity, what the beer finishes out at. Subtract those from each other, and then multiply the resulting factor, the resulting number by a what we call F factor. I've been researching to figure out exactly where the factors come from, but it's a spreadsheet that everyone uses that was, as far as I know, put out by the British Tax and Trade Bureau, or the equivalent, many, many years ago, and it helps you factor to reach the target alcohol content. My personal preference is for low alcohol beer because I like drinking beer, and you can't drink a lot of really strong beer. People could brag about their alcohol tolerance or whatnot, but that's just early onset alcoholism and whatnot. Like, lower alcohol beer is the only way you can really drink beer in reasonable quantities and not be doing yourself permanent damage. So that's why we focus on it, why I focus on it personally. I suppose, at a very root level of personal interest. But beyond that, it's that this brewery is focused on British beers, and more specifically, kind of like the greatest hits of British brewing of the last like 75 years, which includes a lot of really lower alcohol stuff. It's not an intentional search for a niche in the marketplace, like the kind of session IPA craze, as well as they're coming up with some session things that aren't IPA lately. Kind of came up as we were in the process of building the brewery. So it's not intentionally riding a trend. It's just sort of like, we're saying these styles have been around for a while. Say you like IPA, give session IPA, give this stuff a try. But it's also been, from a lot of the consumers that we'll get in here, a lot of them kind of view it as a godsend, because ABV's been pretty high and climbing for a little while. Starting to see it die back down, but it's been super high for a really long time. And it's just, it's not to the taste of a lot of beer drinkers. Right. It's not to the taste of some beer drinkers. I can't say everybody is going for that, but it provides more diversity for the consumer. So the other reason we also do it, and why I think it's good for us, is we're doing cask ale, and casks, because of the lower carbonation level, don't seem to do as well with higher alcohol beers. So a lower alcohol content seems to suit that type of service much better.
You keep good notes and you keep it clean, and don't be afraid to reach out and email other homebrewers. There's so much available information online. It's hard to screw up a homebrew.
My personal preference is for low alcohol beer, because I like drinking beer, and you can't drink a lot of really strong beer. People could brag about their alcohol tolerance or whatnot, but that's just early onset alcoholism and whatnot. Like, lower alcohol beer is the only way you can really drink beer in reasonable quantities and not be doing yourself permanent damage.
Maintaining consistency is so important when it comes to brewing for the masses. Another important thing consumers care about, alcohol content, which is just what you're about to learn in our next lesson. Then you'll hear from our experts about what to do when things go wrong.